Today I'll be finishing up my discussion of the 1840s, focusing on the Mexican War and the California Gold Rush. When I left off last time, I was discussing how an ongoing border dispute between Mexico and Texas had finally reached crisis proportions in 1845. And specifically, this debate centers on where the border between Texas and Mexico is. The United States argues that the border of Texas and Mexico is at the Rio Grande River. The Mexican government argues that the Nueces River, a little bit further north, is the border. Looking at our map here, just to kind of refresh our memories, this western portion of what is today Texas is the area in dispute. The U.S. arguing, of course, that the Rio Grande River is the border between Texas and Mexico. The Mexican government saying that the Nueces River, starting at the Nueces River and extending north, is where the border lies. So this entire portion of West Texas is claimed by both countries. And whenever you have a situation where you have disputed territory, both or two countries claiming ownership of the same piece of land, there's always the potential hazard here for conflict. If they're unable to resolve this diplomatically, then conflict is their only real option. And that's what's going to happen here beginning in 1845. Suspecting that Mexico might make an aggressive move in this disputed territory, President Polk sends about 3,500 U.S. troops under the command of General Zachary Taylor down to the Nueces River here on the map you see. So Polk is positioning U.S. troops just in case something happens, just in case they're unable to negotiate a peaceful compromise here. The president wants to have troops on the ground in the area just in case they're needed. What Polk also does is that he sends word out to some Americans who are living in what is today California, which at the time was still part of Mexico, urging them to or reassuring them that if they rise up against the American or against the Mexican government, that the U.S. government would support them with military support. He also sends word to the U.S. Pacific Fleet to stage themselves off the coast of California and be prepared for possible war with Mexico. So here, President Polk is kind of positioning his pieces, anticipating this conflict. And in a minute, it'll look like a little bit more than just anticipating. It'll have the appearance that the president is indeed trying to provoke a war with Mexico in order to seize this disputed territory. So what will end up happening is that after President Polk positions his pieces, he's got troops stationed along the Nueces River, he's got the U.S. fleet positioned off the coast of California. Polk makes one last attempt to reconcile with Mexico. He offers the Mexican government $30 million in exchange for a border that's favorable to the U.S. Perspective. Basically, giving or acknowledging U.S. claims to this disputed territory. Mexico at this point is digging their heels in. It's kind of a matter of pride for them at this point. They still believe, the Mexican government still believes that the United States acquisition of Texas was unjust, and that Mexico still believes they have a claim to all of the Texas territory. So they refuse Polk's offer of $30 million, and this is kind of final. They say we're not going to negotiate anymore. It's at this time Polk orders General Taylor to go ahead and move his troops all the way down to the Rio Grande River, into that disputed territory. Now, what's important to note here is that that President Polk positioned these troops there with the rationale that he was preparing to resist any possible Mexican aggression in this region. And what's happening here is that Polk is the one playing the role of the aggressor by sending U.S. troops into this disputed territory. This is clearly an act of aggression and could even be interpreted as an act of war, especially by Mexico. So this is a very provocational move that Polk is making here, sending these American troops into this disputed territory, a clear act of aggression. Now, what ends up happening is that in April of 1846, of course, this has been this positioning of troops and so forth has been going on for several months now. By the time we get to April of 46, fighting breaks out along the Rio Grande River between U.S. troops and the Mexican army. Now, we don't know who fired first. They didn't know then. We still don't know today. It's unclear as to who fired the first shot. But having two opposing armies in such proximity to each other during a time where their two countries are on the brink of war is inherently dangerous. It's a big risk here, and Polk and the Mexican government, they are not stupid. They know that this is a potential hazard of positioning troops so close to each other, and of course some have argued that Polk did this intentionally. He positioned these troops here, moved them into this disputed territory as an intent, with the intent on provoking Mexico into a war, so that we'd be justified, or the U.S. would be justified in seizing this territory. So regardless of who fired first, nobody knows. The fact that this is unclear, it was unclear in April of 46, and it's unclear today. But despite all this lack of concrete evidence, Polk is going to approach Congress and ask for a declaration of war. When Polk delivers a speech to Congress, wherein he claims that Mexico had invaded the United States, had spilled American blood on American soil, which of course is not true. But because this is disputed territory, technically it's not American soil. So despite this claim, this unsubstantiated claim of a Mexican invasion, it's still enough to get Congress to vote to pass this declaration of war. So in May of 1846, Congress will declare war on Mexico. And this is going to be basically America's first foreign war. For the first time, and all the other wars that Americans have fought in up to this point, they've all been on American soil. Defensive wars, the wars for empire during the colonial era, the Revolution, and the War of 1812, all of those wars were fought on American soil. This is the first time that America will be sending troops into another country, and all the fighting will take place in that country. Almost all of the fighting is going to take place within Mexican territory during this war. So this is our first foreign war. A couple of things that are going to distinguish this war from previous wars. This is going to be an easy win for America. Unlike the back and forth fluctuations of wins and losses in previous wars, this is going to be pretty much a one-sided war. America is going to, now of course they'll have to fight, some battles will be more intense than others, but overall America is going to win this war relatively easily compared to previous wars. And that's going to be attributed to a couple of different factors. First and foremost, American technology is far superior to Mexican technology at this point. Americans are equipped with better weapons, particularly in the way of artillery. But the most important factor that's going to give Americans Americans an advantage during this war is the fact that the United States military has a very well-trained officer corps. Leadership is top shelf here, and the Mexican army just simply does not have this type of leadership. Most of the officers in the Mexican army at this point they were appointed as officers because their father or their uncle was a member of the Mexican government. So these men are not trained soldiers or officers. In the American military, however, we see an officer corps that is very professionally trained. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point in New York had opened up in 1802. So by the time we get to 1846, West Point had churned out numerous graduating classes of military officers, and these are all these officers were trained in military strategies and leadership and how to conduct battles and so forth. all various aspects of warfighting. So by the time we get to the Mexican War, most of the officers in the U.S. military have benefited from this professional training. The rank and file soldiers, to a somewhat less extent, have benefited from some training. We don't see that professional development filtering down through the ranks until later on in the 1800s. But the officer corps at this point is very well trained. We see that many of the officers who were going to fight in this Mexican War will go on to achieve notoriety in the Civil War later on. Officers like Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, famous Civil War generals. Both of these men and many other Civil War officers will be fighting for the first time here in Mexico. Only they'll be fighting alongside each other on the same team. So a lot of the names that we'll become familiar with in the Civil War are making their first debuts on the battlefield here in the Mexican War. At the top of the list, though, are General Zachary Taylor and General Winfield Scott. These are the two top American generals who will basically orchestrate this war with Mexico. Here we see Taylor on the left and Scott on the right. Both West Point graduates, both highly effective leaders and very well trained in terms of their leadership abilities and their warfighting skills, but both very different in terms of their leadership style. Taylor was kind of a soldier's soldier, what the military sometimes refers to as a dirty boots commander. He was always right there in the midst of his troops, leading from the front. He slept where they slept. He ate where they ate. He was always out there doing the job. Winfield Scott was kind of an aristocrat, so to speak. He'd been born come from a privileged background, but the troops had a hard time identifying personally with him. He kind of distanced himself from his troops, but he was just as effective of a leader as Taylor. Both of these men were military geniuses, both able to deliver successful results on the battlefield. And again, these are the two top generals. There'll be numerous other generals that will fight during the Mexican War, and as well as many other officers. These men were just kind of indicative of the type of or quality of leadership that the U.S. is going to have as an advantage during this war. The war is going to take place in three phases, or basically the United States, between Taylor and Scott, they form a three-part strategy in order to win this war with Mexico. The first part is going to be to secure a favorable border between Texas and Mexico. This was what started the whole thing in the first place, so it's top on their list of goals. This must be achieved above all else, is to get settle this territorial dispute. Second goal is to seize California and New Mexico territories. Now, when we talk about the California and New Mexico territory, we're talking about basically all of what is today the southwestern United States. Looking again at a map here, this whole region here is considered California and New Mexico territory. So this is number two. The second goal on our list is to seize this California, New Mexico territory, basically everything between Texas and the Pacific coast. And the third goal is to take control of Mexico's capital city, Mexico City, which is down here in the southern portion of Mexico. So those are the three goals: secure the border between the United States and Mexico along the Rio Grande, seize this California, New Mexico territory, and take control of the capital. Those three goals. And this will take place over a relatively short space of time, in about a year, a little bit more than a year. All of this is going to be accomplished. Despite the rationale for this war, that America had been invaded by Mexico, which of course was unsubstantiated. There was not one single scrap of evidence to support the fact that, or the claim that Mexico had invaded the United States. But there will be a lot of support for this war in Congress and among the American people, but the support is not going to be universal. Unlike the Revolution and the War of 1812, there was widespread domestic support for both of those wars. What little opposition there was minimal. But in this Mexican War, there will be a significant portion of the American people and members of Congress who will oppose this war. When Congress voted to declare war in 1812 against the British, the vote was almost unanimous, with the exception of a few hardline Federalists. In 1846, when Congress votes to declare war, there's quite a bit of congressmen from the North who vote to oppose this war. Not enough to keep it from happening, but there is a significant amount of opposition. So some of this opposition is for various forms. Some of it is political, some of it is economic, and some of it is just some of the American people are protesting the war. So this domestic opposition to the war. Some congressmen from the North, a young Abraham Lincoln, is opposed to this war. They see, Lincoln in particular believes that the rationale for this war, and of course there's others like Lincoln who fall into this category, they believe that the rationale is flawed. Lincoln is not convinced that this is a clear-cut case of Mexico invading the United States and us and the U.S. defending itself. Lincoln, in fact, says this in Congress. He demands that someone show me on the map the spot where Mexico invaded United States territory, and of course no one can. This whole rationale is based on the president's claim that Mexico had invaded the United States. There's no real proof of this. So Lincoln and several other Northern congressmen are not convinced that the war is justified because the rationale is flawed. And among the American people, abolitionists will be the most outspoken opponents of this war. William Lloyd Garrison here again takes the lead in terms of opposing the war, speaking on behalf of the abolitionists. Garrison, he called this war an invasion waged solely for the detestable and horrible purpose of extending and perpetuating slavery in America. The abolitionists claim that the only reason people support this war is to seize more territory from Mexico so that they can expand the institution of slavery all the way to the Pacific coast. So the abolitionist argument here is based on the fact that whether we were invaded or not is irrelevant. The whole rationale for this war is based on the fact that we are trying to seize more territory for the expansion of slavery. Finally, some people among American citizens and some congressmen will be concerned over reports of U.S. brutality in Mexico, and this is during the war, as the war goes on. The press covers the events. Reports come back through the mail, through the media, official reports, and so forth of examples of U.S. troops brutalizing Mexican civilians. Cases of an army or a formation of troops, U.S. troops, will encounter a village that they believe is supporting the Mexican army, and so they'll burn the village down. Or they'll steal livestock and food from Mexican peasants in order to feed the U.S. troops, and things of this nature. And while these incidents are not widespread, they do occur, and the thing to remember about situations like this, it only has to occur one time for it to become an issue. So regardless of whether or not this happens all the time or just one or two examples, the fact that it does actually happen gives cause for concern among several groups of people in the United States who are already kind of opposed to the war. So despite all this opposition, though, within Congress and among the American citizens and the press, despite all this opposition, it's not enough to dampen the overall enthusiasm for this war. Keep in mind, the idea of territorial expansion is a very popular idea in the United States at this time. So the idea of seizing territory from a supposed or an alleged aggressive neighbor seems perfectly justified for most Americans. So despite a lot of the opposition here, there will be general widespread support for this war. But we're not going to get into a lot of the specific battles because this is kind of outside the scope of this class. It's not really a military history class. But between General Taylor and General Scott, the campaign will come off pretty much as planned. There will be fighting will be more intense in some places than others. The Mexican army will resist more intensely during some battles than in others. But for the most part, the war unfolds pretty much the way that Taylor and Scott had planned. So by the time we get to the summer of 1847, most of the objectives have been achieved, with the exception of Mexico City. With Mexico City still under control of the Mexican government and the Mexican military, fighting is going to be most intense during this last portion of the battle. So Winfield Scott will plan an invasion of the southern part of Mexico, in which he will make a move on Mexico City. And so this takes place all in the early part of 1847. What we're looking at here is Scott's invasion of Veracruz, which is on the east coast of Mexico. And of course, in order to get to Mexico City, he has to take Veracruz. This takes several weeks. But what's interesting about this one battle here, and this is kind of our one little piece of military history we're going to talk about. At the time, the technology prevented any kind of large-scale deployment of troops from naval vessels onto land. And this is problematic because Veracruz was guarded by a large fort, and to try and send troops on regular little boats from the ships to the shore would be slow and tedious, and most of those men would probably not survive. As far as you only putting one or two, just a handful of soldiers on the beach at a time would take too long and would be relatively ineffective. So Scott, and this is a good example of his military genius. He designs his own special design, custom designed landing craft, basically. These boats that you're looking at here, these were designed by Scott specifically to be stacked and partially broken down on the decks of these large naval vessels. So the naval vessels, no problem, can carry a lot of troops, but getting the troops to the shore is the problem. So traditionally, the lifeboats or the launches of these ships are very small, can only carry a few men. But these boats here, as you can see, carry large numbers of men. 20 to 30 men can pile into these boats, and these were designed specifically by Scott for this mission, and custom built in New Orleans. They could stack them up on the decks of the ships. They could empty out the entire formation of troops off of one of these naval vessels and land them on the beach en masse. And this was important because this is the only way an invasion like this is going to be successful. So if you can get all the troops on shore at about the same time. If you do it piecemeal, it's easy for the enemy to pick them off a few at a time. So this is the first large-scale amphibious invasion in U.S. history. And this tactic will become a model for how invasions are conducted from now on. In fact, those of you who take part 2 of U.S. history, you study World War II, this strategy, this tactic right here, this is the bread and butter of American forces in World War II, this amphibious invasion. Both the U.S. Army and the Marines in World War II make regular successful use of this strategy, which was pioneered here by Winfield Scott in the Mexican War. So the invasion of Veracruz is successful. Scott moves inward, and over the next few months, he will fight his way to Mexico City, which is the capital of Mexico. And here we see Scott and his army riding into Mexico City, having defeated the Mexican army, and now are able to dictate terms to the Mexican government. Incidentally, this is the first time that a foreign army has invaded Mexico City since Cortez and the Spanish in 1521. So this is kind of a significant moment in the history of Mexico and in the history of the United States. U.S. has won its first defeat in a foreign war, or it earned its first major victory, defeating an enemy in a foreign war, and of course Mexico City falling once again to foreign invasion. All right, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This will bring an official end to the Mexican War, and this takes place in February of 1848. So this is I guess almost a year after Scott had invaded and taken and seized control of Mexico City. About 6 months or so, not quite a year. So a lot of this last few months will be spent, settling minor little skirmishes here and there, cleaning up the battlefield, that sort of thing, and of course negotiating taking place between the U.S. diplomat and of course the Mexican government, negotiating the terms of this treaty. And in this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, basically what will happen is that most of this treaty will be concerned with giving, or the U.S. acquiring territory from Mexico. And basically the United States will get the border that it wanted along the Rio Grande. So the Rio Grande now becomes the official border between the United States and Mexico. Also, the United States will acquire all of the territory between Texas and the Pacific Coast, to include this California-New Mexico territory. And this is we looked at the map earlier. This is a significant amount of territory. It's over a third of Mexico's total territory will be surrendered to the United States during this treaty. Eventually, while all this is unorganized territory at this point, eventually about 7 states will be carved out of this territory. Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California, parts of Colorado, Kansas, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and of course West Texas. So a lot of the states are going to be carved out of this territory. It's an enormous amount of territory. Again, it's over a third of Mexico's total territory. So in terms of territorial acquisition, this is a big win for the United States. The United States gains an enormous amount of territory here, in the neighborhood of 1.25 million acres. In fact, this is the second largest piece of land acquired after the Louisiana Purchase. At any rate, what ends up happening is, of course, President Polk wanted more territory. He wanted to seize more territory, but Scott and Taylor were able to kind of, all right, well, we've achieved all of our military objectives. Now's the time for negotiating. Polk actually wanted the army to seize even more territory, but we end up not taking everything, just kind of taking what we have at the moment and being satisfied with that, because once the war is over and we begin negotiating, it really starts to look like the accusations of these domestic opponents, especially the abolitionists and these northern congressmen, accusing Congress and the federal government, the president, of seizing land just for the purpose of seizing land. This was a war of aggression on the part of the United States with the sole purpose of seizing territory, taking it from our neighbors. So as this treaty begins to take shape, it starts looking like that's actually what we did. We actually just went and seized land from somebody else, took it for ourselves. So to try and squash some of these accusations, we include in this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo a payment. The United States pays Mexico $15 million in terms of war reparations, and so it doesn't look like we just seized the land. It looks like we are paying for it. And we also the U.S. also agrees to assume a little over $3 million in debts that Mexican government owed to the United States. And this kind of helped. And of course, final piece of this is that the United States grants citizenship to all Mexicans who are living in this territory that was acquired by the United States as a result of the war. So these 3 pieces here, paying Mexico the $15 million, forgiving their debts, and of course granting U.S. citizenships to Mexicans who are now living in this newly acquired U.S. territory. This goes a long way toward putting down these accusations of the U.S. government just seizing territory for purely expansionist motivation. So they try to kind of smooth things over here, but the reality is that the relationships between the United States and Mexico is going to be very tense and bitter for the next century or more. Because this, from the Mexican side here, the Mexican perspective, it looks like the United States just invaded Mexico in order to seize part of its territory. This is clearly an act of aggression on the part of the United States. That's what it looks like from the Mexican perspective. And for this reason, it's going to be, even though Mexico was forced, they had no choice but to sign this this treaty, they're going to hold a grudge for a long time because of this. So the relationship between the United States and Mexico are severely damaged because of this war, and it'll be a long time before that recovers. In terms of what it cost the United States to fight this war, a little over 13,000 U.S. Soldiers will die during the Mexican War. Ironically, only about 1,700 men are killed in battle. Over 11,000 of those casualties, those deaths, are the result of disease and exposure. So despite our weapons technology and in terms of an advantage, our leadership technology, we still haven't figured out a way to keep troops alive in the field for extended periods of time in the face of disease and exposure. That's still one of the big challenges of war, and we'll see this pattern of disease deaths outnumbering battlefield deaths, many times. This is a recurring pattern. We've seen this in every war, and this pattern will continue all the way up through World War II, well into beyond the mid 20th century. This pattern of disease deaths outnumbering battlefield deaths. But anyways, just one of the characteristics of war. We'll see this happen a lot. A lot of these men never even saw the battlefield. They have died of disease in camps and so forth long before they ever set foot on the battlefield. But over 50,000 Mexicans will die in this war, and again, a lot of those are civilians too, resulting from starvation and exposure. Again, as cities and villages are destroyed in battles, and some just burned outright. And of course, crops and livestock being seized by both sides. The United States Army and the Mexican Army regularly seized crops and livestock in order to feed the armies. A lot of people will go hungry, and so a lot of those 50,000 Mexicans killed will be the result of starvation and so forth. So in terms of what this accomplished, the territorial acquisition is probably the big factor here, the big distinguishing characteristic of this war, because the United States did gain an enormous amount of territory as a result of this treaty, Guadalupe Hidalgo. And of course, here, looking at the map, you can see how extensive this territory is. All of this yellow color here, this is all territory that the United States gained from Mexico as a result of this war. And you can see here, these dotted lines represent the borders of states that will eventually be carved out of this territory. This little sliver here, the Gadsden Purchase, the United States will purchase this land from Mexico a few years later, for a reason unrelated to the war. But at any rate, this now becomes all of this is part of the United States as a result of this war. All right. After the dust settles in this war, we've got what we wanted, all this territory. What ends up happening is that this massive amount of territory acquired as a result of the war is going to reignite this debate over the expansion of slavery. Clearly, the United States is expanding across the continent now. Will slavery also expand across the continent? That's the big question that comes up again during the Mexican War. Once it becomes obvious, especially once at the beginning of the war, when we identify these goals as territorial acquisition, this question is raised almost immediately. In fact, in 1846, within weeks after Congress's declaration of war, Congress is passing a military appropriations bill in order to fight this war that's just started with Mexico. A congressman from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot, will propose an amendment to this military appropriations bill that forbids or prohibits slavery in any territories that the United States might acquire from Mexico as a result of the war. Well, of course, Congress needs to pass this appropriations bill in order to fund the military campaign that's getting ready to take place in Mexico. So this Wilmot proviso is kind of holding up the show. Basically, prohibiting slavery. Wilmot says if we acquire any territory from Mexico as a result of this war, we should ban slavery, prohibit slavery in any of those new territories. Well, of course, there's enough support to pass this in the House of Representatives, but it dies in the Senate, and for reasons that we've already discussed. With a 50-50 split in the Senate between northern congressmen and southern congressmen, southern senators are able to effectively block this Wilmot proviso. So it'll be rejected by Congress, and Congress here is voting along north and south lines here. It's a sectional vote. Northerners vote to support it, Southerners vote to oppose it, and because the vote is 50-50, it dies. So even during the war, this issue of whether or not slavery will be allowed to expand into these new territories, it becomes part of this debate. And of course, this helps fuel domestic opposition to the war. But when Congress passes its appropriation bill, it will not include this Wilmot proviso. But that doesn't mean the debate goes away. Just because this Wilmot proviso was voted down in Congress, the idea of trying to restrict slavery in these new territories is gonna stay with us from now on. Slavery is going to come to dominate politics from this moment on, all the way up to the Civil War. The issue of slavery is going to be the centerpiece of most political debates. And all the arguments are going to be here: moral, political, economic. A lot of people are going to oppose it for different reasons. We talked about that last week. We were talking about the abolitionist movement. That just because people were opposed to slavery didn't mean they want to get rid of it. But there is a growing support, especially in this moral argument against slavery, to bring about the eventual end of the institution. So this debate over slavery renews itself during the war, and it will continue on after. Once the war is over and the United States has acquired all this new territory, Congress then sets about the task of debating this issue. Will we allow slavery to expand into these newly acquired territories, or will we prohibit it? So, as it turns out, 1848, the year of the war, the year the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, is also an election year. So, so this is all fresh. What just happened in the war, this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war, all of this is still fresh in everyone's mind as we enter this election year. And what ends up happening is that because slavery is such a contentious issue, it's so controversial, so hotly debated, it is generally advisable, if you're running for office, to steer away from commenting on this particular issue, because if you do, if you take a strong stand on this issue of slavery, you run the risk of alienating half of the potential voters, especially if you're talking about a presidential election. And that's what we're talking about here in 1848, this presidential election. None of the candidates really take a strong stance on slavery as an attempt to try and gain as many votes as possible. If you avoid the topic of slavery, you run a better chance of getting support from both sides of the country. If you take a strong stand on slavery, whether it's for or against, it doesn't matter. You're gonna alienate half the country. They're just gonna lose. You're gonna lose half the voters even before election day ever comes around. So we've got three candidates in 1848. Lewis Cass from I think Michigan. He's a senator from Michigan. Cass is Democrat. Cass will run on a platform of popular sovereignty. Cass, when asked, okay, Senator Cass, what is your stance on the expansion of slavery? Cass says, you know what, it shouldn't be the federal government's responsibility to decide this issue. Cass says he believes in popular sovereignty. Let the people living in those territories decide for themselves. If the people living in these frontier territories, if they want to have slavery or if they want to oppose slavery, that's their decision, and the federal government shouldn't weigh in on that. So Cass is he says, okay, it doesn't matter what my opinion is because the states and the territories should decide for themselves. This enables this of course appears to be democratic. Okay, yeah, let the people decide. That's always a popular idea, hence the term popular sovereignty. Cass's position here also enables Congress to kind of take a step back and kind of wash its hands of any kind of responsibility here in terms of deciding this issue. So a lot of people are excited about this issue or this idea of popular sovereignty, especially among Southerners. We see a lot of support for this idea of popular sovereignty. The Whig candidate will be Zachary Taylor of recent Mexican War fame, and the Whigs make a very conscious effort here to avoid taking a big stand on slavery. In fact, that's one of the reasons why they nominated Taylor for their candidate, is because Taylor is a war hero, so he's already very popular all the way across the country. Everybody loves Taylor because they see him as a big hero of the Mexican War, and especially the soldiers that served under him, they love him. And most importantly, though, Taylor is he does not have a big political background. Taylor has never really weighed in on this debate over slavery. He's never offered a public opinion over slavery one way or the other. So Taylor is he's a safe candidate because he's not really connected to this controversial issue in any way. Taylor's never held public office before. He's never even voted before. It's kind of ironic that a man who has never even cast a vote in any kind of election could be elected president. So it's just kind of a safe bet for the Whigs here. The fact that he has no political connection to this issue, this controversial issue over slavery, and the fact that he's a well-loved war hero, Taylor seems like a very safe candidate in this 1848 election. So despite the Democrats and the Whigs taking a kind of a non-committal position to this issue of slavery, there are some who do take a stand against slavery. Some of the we'll see this Free Soil Party, a third party emerging again here to contest this 1848 election. While the Whigs, for the most part, loved Taylor, they thought it was a safe bet for candidate here for presidency. A lot of the Whigs, these northern Whigs who were strongly involved with the abolitionist movement, they could not in good conscience support Taylor because he was from the South. He was a slave owner. Taylor was from Virginia, but he owned a large plantation in Louisiana. He owned over 100 slaves. So as a slave owner and as a plantation owner, a lot of the Whigs saw Taylor as not really the kind of candidate they could endorse. So they called themselves conscience Whigs. They could not in good conscience support Taylor, who was a slave owner, if they were committed to their abolitionist movement. So these conscience Whigs, as they call themselves, will leave the Whig Party and join this Free Soil Party, along with some radical Northern Democrats who call themselves barn burners, just because of their radical nature. At any rate, so we'll see a new party being formed again here, and you can follow along with this on your political party genealogy chart that I gave you on D2L. So these two groups, some radical Northern Democrats and the abolitionists, will join this Free Soil Party. Free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. That's their motto, right? They wanted to bar slavery in these Western territories for a variety of reasons. They're going to nominate former President Martin Van Buren as their candidate. Van Buren, of course, had previously, or by this point, Van Buren, he was not really what you call an abolitionist, but he would readily acknowledge the fact that most people, in fact, he was quoted once as saying, "The minds of nearly all mankind have been penetrated by a conviction of the evils of slavery." So while Van Buren never really took an active role in the abolitionist movement, he was opposed to slavery, and he acknowledged this in this 1848 campaign. In the final analysis here, Zachary Taylor will win this election. And despite his popularity, his widespread popularity as war hero, he will only win by a relatively narrow margin. There's still a lot of support for Lewis Cass and his idea of popular sovereignty. The Free Soil Party won't get any more than about 10% of the vote, so they're kind of a non-starter. And we see that's pretty typical with third parties. Anytime a third party forms, it's usually in a situation like this where there's some sort of controversial issue at stake here, and the third party can't really get on board with either of the two main party lines, and they'll break away and form their own party. And they rarely bring down more than 10 or 15% of the vote. So that's the case here. Free Soil Party is a non-starter. Taylor is going to barely edge out Cass. And again, this is just—it's hard to really compete with Taylor's widespread popularity here. He's a safe candidate, and so the Whigs will win another presidential election here with Zachary Taylor, and we'll see what he is up to. We'll talk a little bit more about Taylor in the next session. For now, though, we need to take a look at what's going on the same year, 1848. While this election is going on, while America is still deciding how it's going to respond to all this newly acquired territory, this issue of slavery, and so on and so forth, something big is happening out in California. At the same time, all this is going on at the same time. At a place out in California, just a few miles away from Sacramento, a place called Sutter's Creek, a tiny little logging camp. Some loggers building a new mill are going to discover gold in this Sutter's Creek. And of course, let's take a quick look here at our map. Here's Sacramento, California. Of course, California is just a territory at this point, recently acquired from Mexico. In fact, the ink isn't even dry on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo when this gold rush really starts to take place. So Sacramento is just a small trading post in this California territory. About 30 miles or so to the west of, to the east of Sacramento, the small lumber camp or logging camp named Sutter's Mill. And of course, here is a photograph of John Sutter in front of his mill at Sutter's Creek. And of course, they're building this mill to saw logs for lumber. And again, this is a very tiny little place. Here's an artist's depiction of Sutter's Creek. It's just a logging camp. This is not a big town. It's not a city. It's just a few dozen men living here working this logging camp. But in the process of building this mill, they discovered gold. And what's going to happen is that within about 4 years of this initial discovery of gold in California, over $200 million worth of gold is going to be dug out of California. Sutter's Creek and the surrounding valleys going to produce about $200 million of gold in those first 4 years. By the time we get to the Civil War, within about 10 years, over $2 billion in gold will have been produced by these California gold mines. To put that in today's terms, $2 billion in 1860 is equivalent to about $65 billion today. So this is an enormous amount of money. We cannot overstate the impact that this gold rush is going to have on not just the U.S. economy, but the world economy. Basically, this is going to create a flood of gold, precious metal, into the global economy, and it's going to really have a significant impact, especially here in America, of course, in terms of how this impacts the economy. Of course, most of this gold that we're going to be digging out of California is going to be extracted and using very primitive means. Here we're looking at a small gold claim, in some unidentified creek in somewhere in California. Basically, this is how they're digging the gold out. They'll sift mud out of the bottom of the creek. They'll strain it in this what they call a sluice, and they'll strain all the mud and water out, and what's left is the little bits of gold dust. We're not talking about big giant nuggets of gold. We're talking about small flakes of gold, little flakes, little pieces of gold dust, and they're sifting. This is very tedious and time-consuming, but they're finding enough gold dust in an operation this size can produce enough gold dust to to sustain this family for the next month or so. But of course, once we find gold in one creek, word gets around, and that's why they call it the gold rush. People come rushing in. This is a different creek here, but it's an example of how quick this escalates. People will come rushing in from all over the place to this same creek, and they'll start digging out gold. They'll each get a little claim. Now, this is not one large-scale operation here. These are all individual people all digging out there. You got a little section of the creek here. These guys got a little section here, and so on and so forth. And this has a huge impact, not just in terms of the local economy, but the environment too. In fact, we follow this through towards the end of this gold rush as we get into the 1850s, 1860s. This is how they're mining the gold. They instead of just sifting through the bottom of a creek, they'll just use hydraulic hoses, and they'll just blast away at the mountainside, basically speeding up the erosion process. The gold dust that found its way into the creek beds, that was from years worth of erosion. They'll just speed up the process here with these hydraulic hoses. And of course, this is not mechanical. Basically, what they do is they'll dam the creek several miles upstream, and they'll run pipes in decreasing diameters. And as the diameter of the pipes gets smaller, the same volume of water begins to pressurize. By the time it gets to this nozzle here, it's under a great deal of pressure. And they just blast away at the side of the mountain, and of course producing mud, and then they'll pick up the process with straining out the gold flakes and so forth. They're just speeding up the process here, but it's still pretty much the same way. And of course they'll produce this over a 10-year period. They're going to produce this $2 billion worth of gold, again using these crude means. And of course, one of the reasons they call it the gold rush is that people, like I said, people are rushing here from all parts of the world, all parts of the United States, and even places from foreign countries. Word will spread about the discovery of gold in California, and you know how rumors work. By the time the story of Sutter's Mill gets to New York, the story is so blown out of proportion that people are convinced that you just go out to California and you just walk out in the woods, you're tripping over big chunks of gold. So these rumors and these wild stories are going to draw a lot of people. Over 300,000 people are going to move into California in the space of about 10 years. And a lot of these are going to show up within that first year. Just in 1849, we're going to see tens of thousands of people pouring into California in that first year. It'll taper off a little bit as time goes on, but it's most intense during those first few years. We'll see a couple of different things taking place as a result of this large-scale immigration into California. A lot of people coming from Texas and other places in the South, they're bringing their slaves with them. It's okay. I got a plantation here in Alabama or Texas or wherever. I got slaves working on my plantation. I go to California and I can look for gold. I'll just take my slaves with them. I don't have to get my hands dirty. The slaves will dig out all the gold, and I'll be rich. So a lot of people from the South take advantage of this, but they're bringing their slaves with them. So what ends up happening is that we see a lot of conflict ensuing over the use of slaves. The conflict arises between individual prospectors, people, somebody from New York or Pennsylvania or Ohio or wherever. They sold their farm and they moved out here to California to try to strike it rich, but they're competing alongside of a guy who's using 20 slaves, and they get concerned that, okay, these slaves are going to dig out all the gold. There's not going to be any left for me who's working by myself. So we see a lot of conflict between these gold miners over the use of slaves, and this will eventually become an issue once California is ready to become a state here in a few seconds. This issue of slaves being used to mine gold will be one of those issues. Most of these 300,000 people who come to California looking to strike it rich, most of them don't make anything. In fact, very few of them will strike it rich. The number of people who come away with pockets full of money as a result of this are a very small minority. In fact, a lot of people who come out here will lose everything. They'll sell all their possessions and their homes, their farms, and they'll go to California looking to strike it rich, and they'll lose everything. They'll spend all the money that they brought with them on supplies and food, and they will find not even one little scrap of gold. Most of the people who do find gold, they find just enough gold dust to sustain them in their efforts to find more gold. So basically over the course of a month or so, they'll find a small little bag of gold dust, or enough gold dust to fill up a small little pouch, and they'll take it and exchange it for supplies that they need to continue their search for gold, tools and clothing and tents and food and so on and so forth. These things will this is a hard life mining for gold, and they'll consume a large amount of supplies doing it, and of course most of them will barely break even in terms of replacing their supplies. But this replacement, this high demand for supplies and goods is gonna be a big benefit to merchants and traders. In fact, if you're looking at who benefited the most from this gold rush, it's not the people who found the gold. The people who got rich off gold were very few in number, but the merchants and traders are going to be the ones to really benefit from this gold rush. You're a merchant. You still trade goods or general hardware or whatever in a shop in New York or Pennsylvania or wherever, and you're reading the newspaper about a gold rush, people flocking to California in search of gold, and you get this idea. You know what? I'll go out to California. I'll open up a shop in Sacramento or San Francisco or someplace. I'll open up a store there and I'll sell goods and products and clothing and tools and so forth. And these miners who need this stuff to continue their work digging for gold, they'll have no choice but to buy from me. I'll make a fortune. And that's exactly what happens here with a lot of these people. They come out here, they set up shops, these merchants and traders, and they make a fortune selling goods to these miners. Probably one of the best examples of this is a guy named Levi Strauss, a young German Jewish immigrant who was living in I think it was Boston or someplace, some eastern city. He was a tailor by trade. He made clothing. He decides that he's going to go out to California and strike it rich. So he kind of walks away from his textile business, and he goes out to California in search of gold. Well, he's there for a few months or so, and he doesn't find anything. He spent all his money basically looking for gold, and he doesn't find any gold, and he's broke, and he's failed in his attempt to strike it rich. But he noticed one thing. He noticed that, okay, in this lifestyle out here, people's clothing wears out very quickly out here in this rough country, this back country, these coal mines, these creeks, and so forth. Living rough takes its toll on clothing. And traditional men's clothing at the time was they were not very durable. So what Strauss does, he gets the idea to take tent canvas, the canvas that they use to make the tents out of. He'll make, of course, he's a tailor. He knows how to make clothing. He decided, okay, I'll use this tent fabric, this heavy-duty canvas, to manufacture pants, and these will be much more durable, much more practical for this hard lifestyle. And so he starts doing this, and of course, the value of these pants is very obvious to anybody who's ever spent more than a few days out in the bush here in California, living this rough lifestyle. And Levi Strauss makes a fortune off of these jeans. And of course, anybody that's ever worn a pair of Levi's jeans, you know what they look like. This kind of heavy cotton canvas, and the little rivets on the pockets. That's another trademark Levi Strauss feature there. Of course, it takes him a while to get on his feet with these new pants market, but eventually he makes a fortune of it. Of course, he and his family were set for life in terms of the empire that he built over this clothing industry. So Strauss is a good example. There were many others like him who came to California, and while they did not benefit directly from gold mining, they benefited enormously from the demand for trade goods among the mining population. And of course, as the merchants pour in, of course they build their shops. So we see what we call boom towns popping up all over California. This is in 1849. I guess this is the year that it all began. A place called Placerville, California. They find gold here in this valley. Within a month or so, within just a couple months, we see a whole entire town literally popping up. That's why they call them boom towns, because they just exploded out of nowhere. These whole towns, merchants and traders, and of course they bring in. Some people would set up saloons and and prostitution services. So these towns, it's not the kind of place you want to bring your family and settle down, and especially since most of these towns were populated almost exclusively by men. In fact, most of those 300,000 people that poured into California, almost all men. So these boom towns are going to become a signature feature of this California gold rush. Here's another good example. Small, sleepy fishing village of San Francisco. In 1848, there were less than 1,000 people living in San Francisco. Within just a year or two, San Francisco becomes this bustling port. This is the main port of entry for all these people coming out here to search for gold. All these ships in the background, they show up in San Francisco fully loaded of people hoping to strike it rich. They step off the boat, and the first people they meet are the merchants and the salesmen. Hey, you're going to need tools and camping gear and supplies, and I can sell all that in my store. And of course, they buy it up and they head out to the wilderness. They're there for a few months, and they come back a few weeks later looking for more supplies. So places like San Francisco literally explode almost overnight in terms of their growth. So San Francisco will become a major city in a relatively short space of time. And that brings us to the most important aspect of this gold rush story, is that typically new territories acquired by the United States took years and years to establish statehood. A few people would move into the territory. After a few years, they would form a territorial government. The United States Congress would appoint a governor, and of course the people living in the territory would elect a local government, representatives and so forth. And then years and years later, there'd be enough people to qualify for statehood, and they'd draft a constitution and submit their petition. But in California's case, this is going to happen literally overnight. The United States acquired California territory in 1848 as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In about a year, less than a year, by 1849, California has enough people to where they need to organize a government very quickly, or this is going to get out of control. So they take it upon themselves. They organize a local government. They draft a constitution in which they prohibit slavery. Again, we talked about that a few minutes ago. So the people living in California, they draft their constitution and they submit an application for statehood to Congress right away. They completely skipped this whole territorial process and they went straight to applying for statehood. Now, this seems like it might be a good thing for California, but it's bad news for Congress, because Congress is neck deep in debating the status of slavery in these new territories. How are we going to deal with this as new states are formed out of these territories? How might we address this old issue? Well, they don't have time to think about it anymore, because California is already applying for statehood in 1849. So what this does, this creates a sense of urgency in Congress. Congress now doesn't have the time to take to debate this issue and formulate a strategy. They're faced with it right now, and they've got to decide what to do with California because it's on the table, it's ready to go. So Congress now is faced with this issue of dealing with this issue of expanding slavery into these new territories and the process of statehood speeding up very rapidly. So here is kind of where we are in terms of our story in 1850. In terms of territorial expanse, the United States is in 1850 pretty much what it is today. With the exception of Alaska and Hawaii, the United States has acquired all the territory that it has today. So everything between the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean is now all United States territory. Now, of course, most of this western territory is still unorganized, with the exception of Missouri and Texas and now California in 1850. Most of this territory is just unorganized. So our debate over whether or not slavery should be allowed to expand into these territories this debate is going to be renewed again, starting with California. In fact, the debate over California will be almost a play-for-play repeat of the Missouri crisis, to include all those classic arguments, whether or not slavery should be allowed to expand, To what extent can Congress dictate the terms of statehood to these new states, and so forth. So our whole debate is going to be renewed again with the story of California, and that's where we'll pick it up next time.